Nevada's deserts hold far more than endless stretches of sand and rock. Hidden beneath dried lake basins, rugged volcanic ridges, and long-forgotten caves are the remains of ancient cultures that continue to puzzle historians and archaeologists alike. From Ice Age petroglyphs and unusual burial discoveries to abandoned settlements and sacred ceremonial grounds, these remote locations challenge many assumptions about the first people who traveled through and eventually settled the Great Basin. The Grimes Point archaeological area rises quietly from the Nevada desert, just east of Fallon. At first, the landscape seems almost ordinary, a scattering of dark volcanic boulders spread across a dry hillside beneath an endless sky. There are no towering ruins, no ancient walls, and no dramatic structures announcing that this place once held deep significance. But the longer you look, the more the rocks begin to change. Lines slowly emerge from the stone. Shapes repeat themselves across different surfaces. Spirals, grooves, circles, and strange geometric figures begin to reveal themselves one after another. Before long, it becomes clear that you are standing within one of the largest and most mysterious concentrations of ancient rock art in North America. The Grimes Point petroglyph complex contains thousands of carvings etched into basalt boulders, created by volcanic eruptions more than 100,000 years ago. The carvings themselves are far younger, yet still incredibly ancient. Most archaeologists estimate that many of the petroglyphs were created between 2,000 and 8,000 years ago, though some may be even older.
That timeline means countless generations returned to this exact location over thousands of years, adding new marks to rocks that had already been carved long before they arrived. The result is not a single artwork or message, but a layered record of repeated human presence stretching across immense spans of time. What makes Grimes Point especially fascinating is not simply the number of carvings, but the incredible variety of their designs. There are spirals, concentric circles, zigzag lines, dots, grids, arcs, and abstract shapes that resist easy interpretation. Some images resemble maps or pathways. Others appear almost mathematical in their precision. A few suggest animal tracks or natural forms, but most remain stubbornly ambiguous. Unlike rock art hidden deep inside caves or isolated canyons, the carvings at Grimes Point sit openly within the landscape. Anyone walking through the area can see them. That fact alone feels important. These were not secret symbols hidden from the world. They were meant to be visible. The mystery is understanding exactly who they were intended for and why they were placed here in the first place.
To grasp why this area mattered, you have to imagine the environment as it existed thousands of years ago. During much of the period when the petroglyphs were created, the region looked very different from the dry desert visible today. The site sat near wetlands connected to the remnants of ancient Lake Lahontan, a massive prehistoric lake that once covered huge portions of Nevada. Water, fish, migrating animals, and plant life would have drawn people repeatedly into the area. This was not an empty wasteland. It was a rich and valuable environment capable of supporting seasonal communities. Some researchers believe Grimes Point may have functioned as a crossroads, where groups traveling through the Great Basin gathered while following seasonal routes tied to food and water sources. The petroglyphs may have served as markers indicating territory, meeting places, travel routes, or shared ceremonial grounds. The repetition of certain symbols across multiple boulders hints at meanings that would have been understood by the people moving through the region, even if those meanings are now lost to us.
Another interpretation connects the site to ritual and spiritual activity. Many of the symbols found at Grimes Point, especially spirals and concentric circles, appear in cultures all over the world. Across different societies, such patterns are often linked to cycles, movement, time, transformation, or spiritual journeys. At Grimes Point, these symbols appear repeatedly,
sometimes layered directly over older carvings. That layering may be one of the most intriguing aspects of the entire site. In several places, newer petroglyphs were carved intentionally across older ones. This was not random damage or carelessness. It suggests later visitors recognized the earlier carvings and deliberately chose to interact with them. That kind of interaction implies continuity, respect, or perhaps an effort to connect with ancestors whose identities had already faded into distant memory. The people creating later carvings may have viewed the site as ancient even in their own time. There was also an unusual sensory quality to the area itself. Some visitors and researchers have noticed that certain basalt formations produce echoes or amplify sound when struck. Although difficult to verify scientifically, this has led to speculation that the location may have been chosen partly because of how it sounded and felt.
In many cultures, places with unusual acoustic properties become spiritually significant. Sound, echo, and rhythm often play important roles in ceremony and storytelling. If Grimes Point possessed those qualities thousands of years ago, it may have added another layer of meaning to the site. Dating the petroglyphs remains extremely difficult. Like most rock art, the carvings cannot be directly dated because stone contains no organic material. Archaeologists instead rely on nearby campsites, stone tools, weathering patterns, and environmental evidence to estimate age. What researchers can say with confidence is that the site was used repeatedly over an extraordinarily long period of time. This was not the work of a single group or generation. It was a continuing dialogue carried out across centuries, with each generation adding its own marks to a conversation already underway long before they arrived. One of the most enduring mysteries is whether the symbols maintained consistent meanings over time, or whether those meanings gradually changed. A spiral carved 7,000 years ago may not have represented the same idea to someone who carved a similar spiral thousands of years later. The symbol itself may have survived, while its interpretation evolved from one culture to another. That concept, symbolic continuity without fixed meaning, can feel difficult for modern minds to fully grasp. Yet it is entirely possible. Human cultures change constantly, while still preserving fragments of older traditions whose original meanings slowly disappear. There is also the uncomfortable reality that much of the knowledge once connected to Grimes Point may be permanently lost. Languages vanish, oral traditions fade, entire cultures rise, transform, and disappear over thousands of years. What remains are the stones themselves, stripped of much of their original context, and asking questions modern archaeology cannot fully answer. Visiting Grimes Point today is a surprisingly quiet experience. The site is protected and reached by a short walk through the desert landscape. Signs ask visitors not to touch the carvings, and for good reason. The petroglyphs were created by pecking away the dark outer surface of the basalt to reveal lighter stone beneath. Even gentle contact can damage that fragile surface. Details that survived for thousands of years can disappear in moments through vandalism or carelessness. Walking among the boulders, you begin noticing how intentional the placement feels. Some rocks are densely covered with carvings, while nearby stones remain untouched. Certain panels face outward toward the valley, while others face inward toward the hillside.
The Winnemucca Lake petroglyphs sit in western Nevada, in a broad desert basin that feels almost untouched by modern time. Most of the year, the lake bed is dry and silent, its pale, cracked surface stretching toward distant mountains beneath an enormous open sky. At first glance, nothing about the area seems extraordinary. There are no massive ruins, no temples, no towering monuments rising from the desert floor. And yet, carved into limestone formations near what was once the ancient shoreline are markings that may force historians to rethink the earliest chapters of human history in North America. These are the Winnemucca Lake petroglyphs, and what makes them so fascinating is not simply their appearance, but the implications behind them. Some researchers believe the carvings could date back more than 14,000 years. If that estimate is correct, the petroglyphs were created deep in the Ice Age, thousands of years before agriculture, before permanent cities, and long before the timelines many people still associate with the settlement of the Americas. To understand why the site matters so much, you have to imagine the landscape as it once existed. Winnemucca Lake was not always a dry basin. During the last Ice Age, it formed part of a huge prehistoric body of water known as Lake Lahontan.
Lake Lahontan once covered vast portions of northwestern Nevada, creating enormous inland shorelines far beyond the modern landscape. The limestone outcrops containing the petroglyphs would have stood directly beside the water. Ancient people may have gathered there while waves moved below the cliffs. Small boats or rafts could have drifted along the shoreline beneath the carved stone. The petroglyphs themselves are deeply engraved into the limestone. These are not shallow scratches or accidental markings. Many of the grooves cut several centimeters into the rock, with edges that remain remarkably sharp despite thousands of years of erosion and harsh desert weather. The designs are mostly abstract: long straight grooves, zigzag patterns, nested diamond shapes, and branching lines that resemble lightning, rivers, or flowing water. Unlike much of the rock art found elsewhere in North America, there are no obvious hunting scenes, no human figures, and no recognizable animals. That unusual abstract style is one reason the site remains so difficult to interpret. Some archaeologists believe the symbols may represent water, waves, or changes in lake levels over time.
Others argue the carvings may have functioned as symbolic maps, territorial markers, or ceremonial symbols connected to rituals performed near the shoreline. There is also the possibility that the meanings were never intended to be literal at all. The carvings may have expressed spiritual ideas, stories, or beliefs that disappeared thousands of years ago, leaving no surviving explanation behind. Dating the petroglyphs has become one of the most debated aspects of the site. Rock art is notoriously difficult to date directly because stone contains no organic material that can easily be tested. At Winnemucca Lake, researchers relied on indirect methods instead. One important approach involved analyzing carbonate deposits that formed on top of portions of the carvings. These mineral layers accumulate slowly across long stretches of time. By determining the age of the deposits, scientists can estimate when the carvings must have existed before the minerals formed over them. The findings surprised many researchers. Some results suggested the petroglyphs could be approximately 14,800 years old, potentially making them among the oldest known petroglyphs anywhere in the world, not only in North America.
Such dates challenge long-standing assumptions about when humans first arrived in the region and how advanced symbolic behavior may have been during that era. Still, not everyone accepts the conclusions. Critics argue that carbonate dating can be inconsistent and that environmental conditions may have altered the results. Others suggest the carvings may have been modified over time, with later groups deepening or reshaping much older grooves. Those debates remain unresolved, and that uncertainty is part of what keeps the site so mysterious. The evidence refuses to provide a simple or universally accepted answer. What is much harder to deny, however, is the tremendous effort required to carve grooves this deep into solid limestone using primitive stone tools. This was not casual work done by travelers passing through the area. Whoever created the petroglyphs intentionally selected this location and invested enormous time and energy into leaving marks designed to endure for generations. Naturally, one of the biggest questions is who created them. Modern Native American tribes consider the region culturally important, yet the possible age of the carvings suggests they may predate recorded tribal histories in the area. That does not separate the site from indigenous heritage, but it does make the story more layered and complex. It raises the possibility that multiple cultures, spread across thousands of years, interacted with these carvings and interpreted them differently over time.
There is even the possibility that later prehistoric peoples encountered the petroglyphs and wondered about their origins themselves. In other words, the carvings may have become mysterious long before modern archaeologists ever arrived. The thought that generations of humans may have stared at these symbols with the same uncertainty we feel today adds a strange emotional depth to the site. Visiting Winnemucca Lake today feels very different from visiting famous archaeological attractions filled with tourists and museums. There are no crowds, no polished exhibits, and no visitor center neatly explaining every theory. The landscape is overwhelmingly quiet, interrupted only by desert wind and the faint sounds of insects moving through the brush. As you approach the rock faces, the carvings emerge gradually from the stone. The more closely you look, the more deliberate the patterns appear. The lines feel intentional, carefully placed, and repeated with consistency rather than random decoration. The environment itself also contributes to the unsettling atmosphere. The dry lakebed stands in stark contrast to the idea that this was once a massive, thriving lake surrounded by human activity. It forces you to picture an entirely different world: water where there is now dust, movement where there is now silence, and communities gathered around a lake that vanished thousands of years ago.
Some researchers believe the petroglyphs may preserve knowledge connected to environmental change. If the carvings were made during periods when water levels shifted dramatically, they may represent an early attempt to record climate patterns or preserve environmental memory for future generations. In that sense, the site could represent one of humanity's earliest forms of information storage, etched permanently into the landscape itself. Others interpret the site through a spiritual lens. The repeated geometric patterns suggest ritual behavior rather than random artistic expression. Because the carvings were created at the boundary between land and water, the location may have held sacred significance. In many ancient cultures, shorelines and transitional spaces were viewed as spiritually powerful places, associated with ceremonies, offerings, or communication with unseen forces. Today, the site remains protected, though development around it is intentionally limited. That restraint is probably necessary. Rock art is far more fragile than most people realize. A single act of vandalism or even careless touching can permanently destroy details that survived for thousands of years. Ironically, the greatest danger to the petroglyphs is no longer time, but modern human behavior. What lingers with many visitors is not the feeling of having solved a mystery, but the realization that some mysteries may never be fully solved at all. Winnemucca Lake offers very few clear answers. Instead, it reminds us how much of human history exists beyond certainty and beyond complete understanding.
Spirit Cave rests quietly among the desert hills near Fallon. At first glance, nothing about it seems extraordinary. The cave itself is small and shallow, carved into limestone, and surrounded by a harsh landscape shaped by wind, heat, and centuries of isolation. Yet hidden inside this modest shelter was a discovery that would eventually challenge decades of archaeological thinking and ignite a national debate about ancestry, science, and identity. When archaeologists first excavated Spirit Cave in 1940, they uncovered the naturally mummified remains of a man, carefully wrapped in tule reed matting. Nearby were woven sandals, rabbit skin blankets, and other fragile objects remarkably preserved by the cave's dry climate. At the time, researchers believed the burial was only around 1,500 to 2,000 years old. Important, certainly, but not world-changing.
The remains were cataloged, studied briefly, and then placed into museum storage, where they remained largely forgotten for decades. Everything changed in the 1990s when scientists applied more advanced radiocarbon dating techniques to the materials found in the cave. The results stunned researchers. The Spirit Cave mummy was not a few thousand years old at all. He was more than 10,600 years old, dating back to the early Holocene period. That revelation instantly made him one of the oldest naturally preserved human remains ever discovered in North America. Even that extraordinary age was only the beginning of the controversy. Physical anthropologists examining the remains noticed features they believed did not fit neatly within their expectations of early Native American populations. The skull shape and facial structure appeared different from many modern tribal groups in the region. Some researchers speculated that the remains showed similarities to ancient populations from Asia or even Europe. Those interpretations quickly became controversial. What began as an academic discussion soon evolved into a larger cultural and legal conflict. Under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, commonly known as NAGPRA, federally funded institutions are required to return ancestral human remains to culturally affiliated tribes whenever possible.
The Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe requested the return of the Spirit Cave remains, arguing that the individual was ancestrally connected to their people and homeland. However, many scientists initially resisted the request. Because the remains were so ancient, some researchers argued that a direct cultural affiliation could not be confidently established. For nearly 2 decades, the mummy became the center of a tense dispute. Scientists wanted continued access for research, while tribal representatives insisted the man deserved a proper reburial according to their traditions. During that time, the remains stayed locked away in museum storage, as arguments over ancestry, ownership, and scientific authority unfolded largely behind closed doors. What made the situation especially uncomfortable was the deeper issue it exposed within archaeology itself. For much of modern history, ancient human remains were often treated primarily as scientific specimens, rather than as people who once lived meaningful lives. Spirit Cave forced many researchers to confront that mindset directly. This was not merely a skeleton or a data point. It was a human being who had been buried carefully by people who loved and respected him.
The mystery deepened once again during the 2010s, when advances in ancient DNA analysis finally made direct genetic testing possible. With the participation and consent of the tribe, scientists extracted DNA from the remains and compared it to modern populations. The results were remarkably clear. The Spirit Cave mummy was genetically closest to Native American groups, including the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe itself. The findings overturned many earlier assumptions that had relied heavily on physical appearance alone. They also demonstrated that skull shape can be an unreliable tool for determining ancestry, particularly when examining populations separated by thousands of years. More importantly, the DNA evidence confirmed what tribal communities had maintained from the beginning. This man was one of their ancestors. In 2016, the remains were finally returned to the tribe and reburied during a private ceremony. Over time, the detached scientific labels once used to describe him faded, replaced by a more personal recognition of his humanity and cultural connection. Yet even after his reburial, the larger questions raised by Spirit Cave did not disappear. One of the enduring mysteries surrounding the site is what life might actually have looked like for the man buried there. Nevada during his lifetime was very different from the dry desert seen today. The climate was cooler and wetter, with lakes, marshes, and wetlands spread across much of the region as Ice Age glaciers retreated.
The people living there survived as hunter-gatherers, moving seasonally through the landscape with an intimate understanding of water sources, animals, and edible plants. The burial itself reveals surprising care and sophistication. The body had been tightly wrapped in tule reed mats, harvested from wetlands nearby. This was not a careless disposal of the dead. It was a deliberate and respectful burial, requiring time, effort, and planning. That fact alone tells us something profound about early human societies. These communities possessed rituals, emotional bonds, and spiritual beliefs thousands of years before cities, agriculture, or permanent settlements emerged. The choice of Spirit Cave as a burial place also feels intentional. Across many cultures, caves symbolize transition, protection, or a connection between worlds. Whether the people who buried this man viewed the cave in that way can never be proven with certainty, but the decision to place him there does not feel random.
From a scientific perspective, Spirit Cave transformed how researchers understand the peopling of the Americas. The mummy's age supports growing evidence that humans occupied the Great Basin much earlier than once believed.
It also suggests that early populations were far more adaptable and culturally developed than older theories allowed. These were not isolated survivors barely clinging to life at the edge of a continent. They were organized communities capable of preserving traditions, honoring their dead, and adapting successfully to changing environments over thousands of years. Visiting the region today does not feel dramatic in the way many famous archaeological sites do. The cave itself is protected and largely inaccessible to the public. The surrounding landscape is open, quiet, and unforgiving, with vast stretches of desert broken only by distant hills and dry brush. Standing there, it becomes easy to imagine ancient families moving across the terrain according to seasonal rhythms only they fully understood. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Spirit Cave mummy is how the discovery changed relationships between scientists and indigenous communities. It demonstrated that collaboration often produces better and more accurate understanding than conflict. The DNA findings became stronger precisely because tribal participation and consent were included in the process, rather than ignored.
Lovelock Cave rests within a low limestone ridge overlooking the Humboldt Sink in northern Nevada. From a distance, the cave appears almost insignificant, just a dark opening in the rock, easy to overlook unless you already know where to search. There are no towering cliffs or dramatic stone formations surrounding it. Nothing about the entrance suggests that this quiet place would become one of the most unusual and debated archaeological sites in the American West. Long before archaeologists ever arrived, however, the cave already carried deep meaning. Oral traditions from the northern Paiute people speak of a mysterious group known as the Saiteka, often described as red-haired people who once lived in the region and eventually came into violent conflict with the ancestors of the Paiute. According to the story, the final members of this group were trapped inside a cave and killed after a fire was set at the entrance. For generations, this account survived not as legend or entertainment, but as remembered history, passed carefully through oral tradition. In 1911, miners searching for bat guano accidentally broke into Lovelock Cave, and the discovery immediately attracted attention. Beneath thick layers of dried guano were human remains, woven artifacts, tools, and other materials preserved remarkably well by the cave's dry environment.
What quickly became clear was that this was not a simple burial site or temporary shelter. The cave contained a dense archaeological record representing thousands of years of repeated human activity. Formal excavations soon began under archaeologists associated with the University of California, and the discoveries were extraordinary. More than 10,000 artifacts were eventually removed from the cave, including woven baskets, sandals, nets, stone tools, weapons, and famous duck decoys crafted from tule reeds. Some of these objects were over 4,000 years old, making them among the oldest examples of their kind ever discovered in North America. The duck decoys alone transformed archaeological understanding of early hunting cultures in the Great Basin. These were not crude survival tools. They were carefully shaped, realistic, and clearly designed for sophisticated wetland hunting strategies. The craftsmanship revealed an advanced understanding of local ecosystems and challenged older stereotypes that portrayed Great Basin hunter-gatherers as primitive or unsophisticated. Human remains found inside the cave added another layer of mystery. Early researchers described several skulls as unusually large or elongated, while hair associated with some remains appeared reddish or brownish in color. Almost immediately, sensational stories began spreading through newspapers and later fringe publications, claiming the cave proved the existence of a lost race of red-haired giants.
Modern archaeology does not support these interpretations. The skeletal remains fall within normal human variation,
And hair color can change significantly after burial due to chemical reactions in soil and environmental exposure. Dark hair, in particular, can lighten or shift in tone over time. Despite this, the legends persisted, largely because the site felt unusual even to early investigators. What cannot be disputed is the scale of occupation. Lovelock Cave was not used briefly or casually. It appears to have been revisited repeatedly over millennia, functioning at different times as a shelter, storage location, and seasonal refuge. Layers of ash indicate that fires were built inside the cave, sometimes extensively. Some researchers have suggested intentional burning events, though whether these were practical, accidental, or ritual in nature remains uncertain. The possibility of violence is often linked to the Paiute oral accounts, which describe conflict and entrapment. While archaeology has not confirmed a single catastrophic event exactly as described, it also has not completely ruled out episodes of conflict. The presence of burned materials and human remains leaves multiple interpretations open. Oral tradition is sometimes dismissed in scientific contexts, but Lovelock Cave illustrates why it should not be ignored entirely. Even if details shift across generations, such accounts can preserve echoes of real events embedded in cultural memory.
Another layer of complexity comes from environmental change. Earlier occupation levels suggest intensive use tied to wetlands and abundant natural resources. Later evidence points to reduced activity or abandonment, likely connected to the gradual drying of the region as ancient Lake Lahontan receded and local ecosystems changed. The cave's history is therefore closely tied to long-term climate shifts. One of the more overlooked aspects of Lovelock Cave is the sophistication of its textile technology. Baskets, nets, and woven items show highly developed techniques that required significant skill and long traditions of knowledge transfer. These were not experimental crafts, but refined practices passed down across generations. This raises the question of function. In a landscape filled with open rock shelters, Lovelock Cave stands out for its depth, dryness, and stability. It would have been ideal for preserving food and organic materials. Some researchers therefore suggest it may have served as a central storage site, revisited repeatedly by groups moving through the region. Over time, however, the cave's condition and understanding of it were altered. Early excavation and guano mining disrupted layers of deposits that can never be fully reconstructed. Many artifacts were removed for study and storage in museums, while contextual information was lost. By modern standards, excavation methods were often incomplete, leaving gaps in the archaeological record that cannot be recovered. Today, the cave is protected, but feels strangely empty. The artifacts are gone, and what remains is a quiet, hollow space shaped by both natural forces and human intervention. Even so, traces remain visible: darkened ceilings from ancient fires, layered sediments, and the physical sense of enclosure that hints at past human presence. Standing inside, it is possible to imagine the faint echoes of movement, the smell of smoke, and the sense of shelter it once provided. Yet the site is also widely misunderstood. For some, it has been misrepresented as evidence of lost civilizations or extraordinary beings. For others, it serves as a reminder of how easily myth can grow around incomplete evidence. The reality is more grounded, but no less significant. The importance of Lovelock Cave lies in what it reveals about adaptation, survival, and long-term human presence in the Great Basin. It demonstrates how people responded to environmental change, how they stored knowledge in material form, and how they navigated periods of scarcity and abundance.